Dove Books on Tape presents Communion by Whitley Strieber. This is Roddy McDowell. Dove Books on Tape is proud to present Communion, an extraordinary true story by Whitley Strieber. This nationally recognized author describes his effort to deal with and explain a shattering assault from the unknown. It is my great pleasure to tell you this story in the author's own words. To all appearances, I have had an elaborate personal encounter with intelligent non-human beings. But who could they be? And where have they come from? Are unidentified flying objects real? Are there goblins or demons or visitors? At first I thought I was losing my mind, but I was interviewed by 3 psychologists and 3 psychiatrists, given a battery of psychological tests and a neurological examination, and found to fall within the normal range in all respects. I was given a polygraph by an operator with 30 years' experience, and I passed without qualification. The visitors marched right into the middle of the life of an indifferent skeptic without a moment's hesitation. Later, I found a large number of people who have had experiences similar to mine. Most of them were mentally stable. They did not cluster in any particular population group, but formed a cross-section of American society. In my case, there were witnesses and physical after-effects that are hard to ignore. Either what is happening is that visitors are actually here, or the human mind is creating something that incredibly is close to a physical reality. Whatever it is not presently understood by science. What happened to me was terrifying. It seemed completely real. It was in clear, normal memory. Most of it was already present in my mind before I was hypnotized to aid recall. I suffered with this experience. Others suffered and are still suffering. It is essential that effective support be developed to aid those who have it. The scoffing has to stop. People who face the visitors report fierce little figures with eyes that seem to stare into the deepest core of being. And those eyes are asking for something, perhaps even demanding it. Whatever it is more than simple information. The goal does not seem to be the sort of clear and open exchange that we might expect. Whatever may be surfacing, it wants far more than that. It seems to me that it seeks the very depth of soul. It seeks communion. My wife and I own a log cabin in a secluded corner of upstate New York. It is in this cabin that our primary experiences have taken place. I will deal first with what I remember of December the 26th, 1986. This part of my narrative, covering December the 26th, is derived from journal material I had written before undergoing any hypnosis or even discussing my situation with anybody. Our cabin is very hidden and quiet, part of a small group of cabins scattered across an area served by a private dirt road, which itself branches off a little-used country road that leads to an old town that isn't even mentioned on many maps. We spend more than half our time at the cabin because I do most of my work there. We also have an apartment in New York City. Ours is a very sedate life. We don't go out much, we rarely drink more than wine, and neither of us has ever used drugs. From 1977 until 1983, I wrote imaginative thrillers, but in recent years, I had been concentrating on much more serious fiction about peace and the environment, books that were firmly grounded in fact. Thus, at this time in my life, I wasn't even working on horror stories, and at no time have I ever been in danger of being deluded by them. We were having a lovely Christmas at the cabin in late December 1985. After our son went to bed, Anne and I sat quietly together listening to some music and reading. About 8:30, I turned on the burglar alarm, which covers every accessible window and all the doors. For no reason then apparent, I had developed an unusual habit the previous fall. As secretly as ever, I made a tour of the house, peering in closets, and even looking under the guest room bed for hidden intruders. I did this immediately after setting the alarm. By 10 o'clock, we were in bed, and by 11, both of us were asleep. The night of the 26th was cold and cloudy. There were perhaps 8 inches of snow on the ground, and it was still falling lightly. In the middle of the night of December the 26th, I do not know the exact time, I abruptly found myself awake, and I knew why. I heard a peculiar whooshing, swirling noise coming from the living room downstairs. There was no random creak, no settling of the house, but a sound as if a large number of people were moving rapidly around in the room. I sat up in bed, shocked and very curious. The night was dead still, windless. My eyes went straight to the burglar alarm panel beside my bed. The system was armed and working perfectly. Not a covered window or door was opened, and nobody had entered, at least according to the row of glowing lights. Now, what I did next may seem peculiar. I settled back in bed. For some reason, the extreme strangeness of what I was hearing did not rouse me to action. No sooner had I settled back than I noticed that one of the double doors leading into our bedroom was moving closed. As they closed outward, this meant that the opening was getting smaller, concealing whatever was behind that door. I sat up again. I felt wide awake and in full possession of all my faculties. I could not imagine what could be going on, and I got very uneasy. What could be moving the door? Then I saw, edging around it, a compact figure. It was so distinct, and yet so completely, impossibly astonishing that at first I could not understand it at all. I simply sat there staring, too stunned to move. This figure was too small to be a person, unless a child. I believe that it was roughly 3.5 feet tall, altogether smaller and lighter than my son. I could see perhaps a third of the figure, the part that was bending around the door so that it could see me. It had a smooth, rounded hat on with an odd, sharp rim that jutted out easily 4 inches on the side I could see. Below this was a vague area. I could not see the face, or perhaps I would not see it. A few moments later, when it was close to the bed, I saw 2 dark holes for eyes and a black down-turning line of a mouth that later became an O. From shoulder to midriff was the visible third of a square plate etched with concentric circles. This plate stretched from just below the chin to the waist area. At the time, I thought it looked like some sort of breastplate or even an armored vest. Beneath it was a rectangular appliance of the same type, which covered the lower waist to just above the knees. The angle at which the individual was leaning was such that the lower legs were hidden behind the door. In any case, I sat there frightened but unable or unwilling to deal with what I was observing. Because of its isolation, the house not only had a burglar alarm but contained a shotgun, which was not far from the bed at the time. Was that why the thing behind the door was wearing a shield, if that was indeed what it was? The next thing I knew, the figure came rushing into the room. I recall only blackness after that for an unknown period of time. I don't remember falling asleep or lying awake. What I do remember is far, far more disturbing. My next conscious recollection is of being in motion. I was naked with my arms and legs extended, as if I had been frozen in mid-leap. I was moving out of the room. There was no physical sensation at all, not of being touched, not of being warm or cold. I could feel myself as a shape and a mass, but not in terms of sensation. It was as if I had become profoundly paralyzed. Although I wanted desperately to move, I could not. I was, at this point, in a state of panic. Something was hideously wrong, so wrong that my mind went blank. I couldn't think. Even if I had been able to make a sound, which I doubt, I couldn't try. I must have blacked out again, because I have no further memories of being moved. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a sort of a depression in the woods. It was quite dark, and frozen creeper was pressing tightly around me. I remember being startled that there was no snow on the grey earth. I sat with my legs partly bent and my hands in my lap. Although I cannot recall this in any detail, I may have been leaning against something. I was still absent sensation. Across the depression to my left there was a small individual whom I could see only out of the corner of my eye. This person was wearing a grey-tan bodysuit and sitting on the ground with knees drawn up and hands clasped around them. There were 2 dark eye holes and a round mouth hole. I had the impression of a face mask. I felt that I was under the exact and detailed control of whomever had me. I could not move my head or my hands or any part of my body, save for my eyes. Immediately on my right was another figure. This one completely invisible, except for an occasional flash of movement. This person was working busily at something that seemed to have to do with the right side of my head. It wore dark blue coveralls and was extremely fast. While the presence of others remains vague in my mind, the individual to my left made a clear impression. I do not know why, but I had the distinct feeling that this was a woman, and so I shall refer to her in the feminine. She was as small as the others and appeared almost bored or indifferent. I also felt that she was explaining something to me, but I cannot remember what it was. Then I saw branches moving past my face. Then a sweep of treetops. I looked down, and below me the whole tall forest was corkscrewing slowly to the right. There was no chance to question how in the world I'd gotten above the trees. I only saw and recorded. Then a grey floor obscured my vision, slipping below my feet like an iris closing. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a messy round room. My impression is, at this point, I was actually being cradled by these people, as if they were aware of what was about to transpire. While I had up until that point been able to retain a degree of control of my attention, this now left me, and I became entirely given over to extreme dread. The fear was so powerful that it seemed to make my personality completely evaporate. I do not think that my ordinary humanity survived the transition to this little room. I died, and a wild animal appeared in my place. Not everything was gone, though. What remained, although small, nevertheless was occupied with an essential task of verification. I was looking around as best I could, recording what I saw. The small, circular chamber had a domed, greyish-tan ceiling with ribs appearing at intervals of about a foot. Across the room to my right, some clothing was thrown on the floor. As a matter of fact, the thought even crossed my mind that the place was actually dirty. The whole scale of it was small, tight, enclosed. Tiny people were now moving around me at a great speed. Their quickness was disturbing, and in a curious way, ugly. An acute, gnawing feeling of being in a trap overcame me. It was a truly awful sensation, accompanied as it was by the sense that I was absolutely helpless in the hands of these strange creatures. I was seated on a bench, leaning against a wall. The predominant colors were tan and grey. The bench was the same color as the walls and was rimmed by a lip of dark brown. There was something quite beautiful, I think, having to do with a lens in the ceiling, but I can remember little about it. Perhaps there was a lens at the point of the ceiling, through which some colourful scene could be observed. There was no way to be certain of how long I remained in this room. It seemed to be a stay of no more than a few minutes or even seconds. It may have been longer, though, because I had time to look around me and note numerous details. While I had before been totally paralyzed, I was now able to move at least my eyes and possibly my head. One being was on my right, another on my left. Within my field of vision, a great deal of rushing about commenced again. The next thing I knew, I was being shown a tiny grey box with a sliding lid. There was a curved lip at one end of this box, to make it easy to push it open. It was being held by a thin, graceful person, whose appearance was not distinct. My memory of the one that came before me next is of a tiny, squat person crouching, as if huddled over something. He had been given the box and now slid it open, revealing an extremely shiny, hair-thin needle mounted on a black surface. This needle glittered when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, but it was practically invisible straight on. I became aware, I think I was told, that they proposed to insert this into my brain. If I had been afraid before, I now became quite simply crazed with terror. I argued with them. "This place is filthy," I remembered saying. Then, "You'll ruin a beautiful mind." A great sadness overtook me. I do not recall screaming, but evidently I was doing so, because I remember the next exchange quite clearly. One of them, I think it was the one I'd identified earlier as the woman, said, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" This voice was remarkable. It had a subtly electronic tone to it, the accents flat and startlingly Midwestern. My reply was unexpected. I heard myself say, "You could let me smell you." I was embarrassed. This was not a normal request, and it bothered me. But it made a great deal of sense, as I have afterward realized. The one to my right replied, Okay, I could do that," in a similar voice, speaking very rapidly, and held his hand against my face, cradling my head with his other hand. The odor was distinct and gave me exactly what I needed, an anchor in reality. There was a slight scent of cardboard about it, as if the sleeve of the coverall that was partly pressed against my face were made of some substance like paper. The hand itself had a faint but distinctly organic sourness in its odor. It was not a human smell, but it was unmistakably the smell of something alive. There was a subtle overtone that seemed a little like cinnamon. The next thing I knew, there was a bang and a flash, and I realized that they had performed the proposed operation on my head. I felt like weeping, and I recall sinking down into a cradle of tiny arms. Then I was lifted up and seemed suddenly to be in another room, or perhaps I simply saw my present surroundings differently. It appeared to be a small operating theater. I was in the center of it on a table, and 3 tiers of benches were populated with a few huddled figures, some with round as opposed to slanted eyes. I was aware that I had seen 4 different types of figures. The first was a small robot-like being that had led the way into my bedroom. He was followed by a large group of short, stocky ones in the dark blue overalls. These had wide faces appearing either dark gray or dark blue in that light, with glittering deep-set eyes, pug noses, and broad, somewhat human mouths. Inside the room I encountered 2 types of creature that did not look at all human. The most provocative of these was about 5 feet tall, very slender and delicate, with extremely prominent and mesmerizing black slanted eyes. This being had an almost vestigial mouth and nose. The huddled figures in the theater were somewhat smaller, with similarly shaped heads, but round, black eyes like large buttons. Throughout the whole experience, the stocky ones were always present. They were apparently responsible for moving and controlling me, and I had the distinct impression that they were a sort of good army. Why good, I do not know. I do not remember what, if anything, happened in the operating theatre. My memories of movement from place to place are the hardest to recall because it was then that I felt the most helpless. My fear would rise when they touched me. Their hands were soft, even soothing. But there were so many of them that it felt a little as if I was being passed along by rows of insects. It was very distressing. Soon I was in more intimate surroundings once again. There were clothes strewn about, and two of the stocky ones drew my legs apart. The next thing I knew, I was being shown an enormous and extremely ugly object, grey and scaly, with a sort of network of wires on the end. It was at least a foot long, narrow, and triangular in structure. They inserted this thing into my rectum. It seemed to swarm into me as if it had a life of its own. At the time, I had the impression that I was being raped, and for the first time I felt anger. Only when this thing was withdrawn did I see that it was a mechanical device. The individual holding it pointed to the wire cage on the tip and seemed to warn me about something. But what? I never found out. One of them took my right hand and made an incision on my forefinger. There was no pain at all. Abruptly, my memories end. There isn't even blackness, just morning. I awoke the morning of the 27th very much as usual, but grappling with a distinct sense of unease and a very improbable but intense memory of seeing a barn owl staring at me through the window sometime during the night. I remember how I felt in the gathering evening of the 27th, when I looked out onto the roof and saw that there were no owl tracks in the snow. I knew I had not seen an owl. But I wanted desperately to believe in that owl. I told my wife about it. She was polite, but commented about the absence of tracks. I really very much wanted to convince her of it, though. Even more, I wanted to convince myself. From that first day, my wife noticed a dramatic personality change in me, which she thought was similar to a change that had taken place the previous October. We had gone through personal hell then because of my demands and my accusatory behavior, and she did not want that pattern to repeat itself. That first evening, I underwent the initial physical symptom of my ordeal. We had come in from an afternoon of light cross-country skiing, not at all strenuous. I was dead tired. I got chills and went to bed. I thought I must have a high fever. Then our nearest neighbors arrived. They appeared without warning. We tend to be very private in our sparse community, and this was only their second spontaneous visit in the 2 years that we have been neighbors. Feeling somewhat better, I went downstairs to see them. No sooner had we started talking than I found myself complaining that I thought I had seen a light of a snowmobile in the woods between our houses about 3 in the morning. I was horrified at myself. What was I saying? I couldn't remember any such thing, and I knew it even as I spoke. Our neighbors offered the thought that the woods were too thick for the snowmobile to maneuver, which is true. My memory of the snowmobile was as hollow as my memory of the owl. After some small talk, our neighbors went home. I was not pleased with my own behavior, and I found it hard to understand because it seemed so non-volitional, almost as if I had been talking against my will. I did not know that the owl and the light were screen memories that concealed a traumatic experience. As described by Freud, the screen memory is a method that the mind uses to shield itself from things too upsetting to recall. At the time, I had no idea that I was suffering from emotional trauma, or that dozens of other people had been through very similar ordeals after having been taken by the visitors. My mental and physical states continued to get worse. An infection appeared on my right forefinger. It looked like a splinter injury, but I could not remember getting a splinter. unless it was from some log I'd carried in for the stove. The injury festered. Neither iodine nor antibiotic ointment seemed to help. I looked for a bit of splinter, but could find nothing. I noticed that I was uncomfortable sitting because of rectal pain, a weird and disturbing symptom. In the ensuing days, I experienced more bouts of fatigue. I would be working and suddenly would get cold and start to shake. Then I would feel so exhausted that I could not go on and crawl into bed, quivering and miserable, sure that I was coming down with the flu. Nights I would sleep, but wake up in the morning feeling as if I had been tossing and turning the whole time. I ceased to dream, and sometimes had difficulty closing my eyes. I felt watched and kept hearing noises in the night. Mornings I would wake up with the feeling that I had been somehow on guard. My disposition got worse. I became mercurial, frantic with excitement about some idea one moment and despair the next. I was suspicious of friends and family, often openly hostile. On the afternoon of January the 3rd, we were skiing when I got a pain behind my right ear. My skull ached and my skin was sensitive. In the middle of this sensitive area, my wife could see a tiny pinpoint of a scab. I believe that the combination of the infected finger, the rectal pain, and the aching head were what finally brought my memories into focus. The confused swirl resolved into a specific series of recollections, and when I saw what they were, I just about exploded with terror and utter disbelief. One of the memories would come into my head, linger there for a moment, then leave me with my heart pounding, gasping, sweat pouring down my face. I thought I had lost my mind. For half of my life I have been engaged in a rigorous and detailed search for a finer state of consciousness. Now I thought my mind was turning against me, that my years of eager study of everything from Zen to quantum physics had led me into some strange and tragic byway of the soul. For a couple of days I lived with it. Maybe the symptoms would subside. Then, quite suddenly, one afternoon, I recall the smell. Their smell. It came back to me as clearly as if I had inhaled it not a moment before. That totally real memory saved me from going stark, raving mad. In the first week of January, a local newspaper published the accounts of an object, or objects, being sighted in our area. The headline called the appearance a hoax, but according to the story, local people who had witnessed the event doubted that. As it happens, the 18-year-old son of one of our neighbors saw something hovering near a road not 5 miles from our cabin at approximately 9:30 on a night in late December. He described it to me as huge and covered with lights. Being the son of a former state trooper and pilot, he did not claim that it was a UFO, but simply told the truth. He did not know what it was, but it appeared to be a solid structure, and as it hovered for a substantial period, more than 15 minutes, it could not have been a flight of planes. Research revealed to us that our area of upstate New York, comprising roughly Westchester, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, and Ulster counties, had an absolutely extraordinary series of sightings of boomerang, or triangular-shaped objects of enormous size, starting in 1983. Town police officers, sheriffs, state troopers, even in one case an entire town government en masse, viewed the things, which have been described as being the size of an aircraft carrier. When we went to New York City for a stay in January, we still knew almost nothing about UFOs, and nothing at all about these sightings. Life did not return to normal. I felt a little better, but I was terribly uneasy. My difficulty relating to my wife and son continued. I read a book my brother had sent me for Christmas called Science and the UFOs by Jenny Randalls. and the astronomer Peter Warrington. Toward the end of the book, I was astonished to read a description of an experience similar to my own. When I read the author's version of the archetypal abduction experience, I was shocked. They were talking about people who think they've been taken aboard spaceships by aliens, and I seemed to be such a person. My blood went cold. I decided just to lock the business away in my mind. A few mornings later, at about 10, I was sitting at my desk when things just seemed to cave in on me. Wave after wave of sorrow passed over me. I looked at the window with hunger. I wanted to jump. I wanted to die. I just could not bear this memory. I could not get rid of it. What on earth were those things? What had they done to me? I remembered that a man named Bud Hopkins had been mentioned in the book as a prominent researcher in the field. I found his name in the phone book. I called Bud Hopkins. He answered the phone and listened to my story for a few minutes. I thought I would wither away with embarrassment telling it, but soon he interrupted me. Could I come over, like right now? Hopkins was a large, intense man with one of the kindest faces I had ever seen. The moment our interview began, Hopkins explained that he was not a therapist, but he could put me in touch with one if I wanted that. As I sat in that man's living room, listening to him tell me that I wasn't alone, that others had gone through very much the same thing, the tears rolled down my cheeks, and I went from wanting to hide it all to wanting to understand it. It was during that first meeting that he asked me if anything else had happened in the past, anything unusual. The question seemed to trigger something in me. After a moment's reflection, I blurted out, I seem to remember a night the house burned down, but it didn't burn down. All hell had broken loose on a night in early October. There had been an explosion that woke up the whole household. Strange things had happened, but for some unknown reason, we had simply put them out of mind. We hardly even discussed them. But that time, they didn't happen only to me. We had house guests. If anything had really happened, they would certainly remember. I'd contact the witnesses. They would, of course, report that they remembered nothing. Then I would begin the painful but thankfully well-understood process of accepting that I had been the victim of some sort of unusual mental phenomenon. I would enter therapy and learn to forget the mysterious visitors. But why had I not thought of or discussed the events of October the 4th before? In retrospect, the only reason I can advance is that I did not want to face just how strange the events of that night had really been. But when I thought them over, they began to seem distinctly eerie, even frightening. We often deal with fear by rejection, and in this case, as will soon be evident, there was more than enough reason to be terrified. On October the 4th, 1985, my wife, son, and I drove up to our cabin in the company of two close friends, Jacques Sandulescu and Annie Gottlieb. We have known Jacques and Annie for about 5 years. He weighs nearly 300 pounds, is a black belt in karate, and does 100 push-ups at a session. She is also a black belt, but weighs perhaps 120 pounds. She is intellectual, he is physical. Both are writers. The night of October the 4th was foggy in Ulster County. We had dinner at a local restaurant and arrived at the cabin at about 9 in the evening. I turned on the pool heater so that the pool would be comfortable for use the next day. Then I lit a fire in the wood stove. We were all sleepy, so sleepy that we went off to bed almost immediately. Anne and I retired to our upstairs bedroom. Jacques and Annie went to the guest room and closed the door, and our son went to his corner bedroom beside theirs. He left his door open. From my bed, with the bedroom doors open, I could see out across the cathedral ceiling of the living room to a hexagonal window set in the peak of the roof. Over the next hour, the fog grew thicker and thicker. When I turned out my reading light, I was enveloped in absolute blackness and total silence. I slept dreamlessly for a period of time, perhaps as much as 2 or 3 hours. Then I was startled awake and saw, to my horror, that there was a distinct blue light being cast on the living room ceiling. I was frightened because it wasn't possible for there to be any light there. Car lights from the road could not be cast on that ceiling. My mind inventoried the possibilities as I watched this blue light slowly creep up the ceiling, as if whatever was causing it was slowly moving down into the front yard from above. Finally, I hit on what seemed to me a sensible solution. The chimney must be on fire and dropping sparks into the front yard. I had to do something about it at once. Then I fell into a deep sleep. The last thought I remember before dropping off, with my heart still hammering, was that the roof was on fire. I do not know what time this all took place, but it was well after midnight. Sometime after I fell back to sleep, I was awakened again, this time by a loud report, as if a firecracker had popped in my face. My wife cried out, and downstairs my son began shouting. When I opened my eyes, I was stunned to see that the entire house was surrounded by a glow that extended into the fog. I thought to myself, "You damned fool, you fell asleep, and now the fire's gotten worse." I finally managed to get up. As I did so, I said to Anne, "The roof's on fire. I'll get our son and wake up the others." I started downstairs. I hadn't gotten halfway across the room before the glow suddenly disappeared. I was very confused. There was nothing to do but to tell Anne that I had made a mistake, then go downstairs and comfort my son. On the way, I met Jacques in the hall. His presence terrified me, and I jumped back away from him. Then I apologized for being so startled by a friend, told him to calm down and go to bed, and added that nothing was wrong. I continued into my son's room and embraced him. In a few minutes, I was back in bed, and the household was again asleep. The next morning, little was said about the incident. I do not remember Annie mentioning that Jacques had been bothered by the light the night before. I didn't understand that because their bedroom door had been closed, they couldn't have seen the bathroom light, which is left on for our son. I didn't remember my confusion about the fire. As far as I was concerned, Annie and Jacques had been disturbed by the light, but I hadn't been. Later that week, I found myself a little agitated without knowing quite why. I had a persistent memory of light flashing in my eyes that night, and I vaguely recalled some sort of an explosion. The next weekend, I had a very clear and dramatic memory of a huge crystal standing on end above the house, a glorious thing, hundreds of feet tall, glowing with an unearthly blue light. I told Anne about it, and as I was talking, I experienced a hollow sort of feeling. I knew that she didn't believe me. Of course she didn't. And I didn't believe myself. I put it out of my mind permanently. On February the 6th, 1986, I came home from Bud Hopkins' house brimming with eagerness. I was sure I would put an end to this by asking careful questions. I first asked my wife to think back to October the 4th. It wasn't hard to identify the specific night because it was the last time that Jacques and Annie had come to the country, and the thickness of the fog was unusual. I was disturbed that Anne at once remembered being awakened by a bang. She did not see the glow, but my initial warning about the fire apparently didn't penetrate her sleep, because all she did recall was my saying that there was no fire. I asked my son, "Do you remember the last time that Jacques and Annie went to the country with us?" "Yeah, the night of the bang." So he had also heard it. "A bunch of people told me it was okay. You just threw your shoe at the fly." "What people?" "Oh, just a bunch of people. People who were around." This answer shocked me badly. I left off questioning him and called Bud Hopkins, who suggested that I asked my son not about memories, but about dreams. Taking this advice, I next asked my son if he remembered any unusual dreams. This was his reply, spontaneous and immediate. I dreamed that a bunch of little doctors took me out on the porch and put me on a cot. I got scared, and they started saying, "We won't hurt you," over and over in my head. That is my strangest dream, because it was just like it was real. He could not say if he had had that dream on the night of October the 4th. He only knew that it had happened at the cabin. Next, I spoke to Jacques Santelesco on the phone. I asked, "Do you remember anything about the last time you and Annie came to the country?" "The light," he said. "I was sleeping. All of a sudden, something woke me up. I saw the room was full of light, bright like daylight, not like the moon. I thought we overslept. I looked at my watch. It says 4:30. Then I hear you through the door saying it's okay, the light is gone, so I go back to sleep." Nothing I can conceive of can account for the major light phenomena on that night. I visualized the whole roof being ablaze. Jacques thought it was mid-morning. Because of the fog, a helicopter, or indeed any sort of airplane, was out of the question. And what about the explosion? Maybe it was thunder. But there were no thunderstorms in the area. Perhaps a freak bolt in some sort of unusual mini-storm caused it then. But the period of seeming daylight lasted many seconds and was not apparent to anybody until after the explosion. Thunder follows lightning, not the other way around. And so far there was no way at all to account for Annie Gottlieb's testimony. I spoke to her immediately after talking to Jacques. Like the rest of us, Annie was awakened by a loud explosion. She reports, "It was a bang, and then I heard the scurry of little feet running across your bedroom upstairs. It must have been the cats." "Annie," I said, "the cats were in the city. We don't take them weekends because they don't like the carrier." "You're kidding. I always just assumed it was the cats." Anyway, I vaguely remember the light. Mostly I remember the noises. A few minutes after the scurrying, I heard you come downstairs. You said through the door not to worry. And the next morning you told me that some people had come down from a spaceship to visit. What, Annie? I never said any such thing. Well, now that I think of it, I don't know where I got the idea anybody said it. At that point, I almost wished that I had never asked my witnesses anything. I said goodbye and put the phone down. I realized finally and inescapably that something very peculiar was going on. I thought back across the months to October. The fall had been an awful time for me and my wife. Around the second week of October, I had become extremely fearful about living in the New York area and decided to move. Had my terror stemmed from that night? And what about all my nervousness, my secret searching under beds and in closets, my unreasonable fear of prowlers? It seemed to me that I had been growing increasingly uneasy with the passing months. The last week of October, I had decided that I couldn't live a moment longer in New York. I decided that I wanted to move to Austin. I went to the University of Texas there, and it was a city that both Anne and I love. After Halloween, we went down to Texas and arranged for our son to attend a local private school and began the process of buying a house. One evening in Austin, we were looking at the house we had chosen to buy. My wife was inside talking to the realtor and the owners, and I walked out onto the deck. When I looked at the dark canyon that stretched out into the shadows and the stars in the evening sky, I felt suddenly and absolutely afraid. It was exactly as if the sky were a living thing, and it was watching me. What was even more frightening was my clear awareness that this was a paranoid fantasy. I thought then that my mental health was not good, and soon I would either have to calm down or take steps to improve it. But I could not live in that house. In fact, I could never enter it again. End of side 1.